On the evening of Friday, the 21st of May, 1993, a 29-year-old woman named Kem Winginger stood in the basement of the Golden Congregational Church in a small, rural part of Iowa. Her face was lit up with a genuine, happy smile as she clapped her hands together. Around her were her closest friends, people who had watched her go through some very tough times, and now they were all here to celebrate a new beginning for her. They had gathered to throw Kem and her fiancé, a 32-year-old man named Kurt Simon, a party. It was a combination wedding shower and a goodbye party, because their lives were about to change in a big way. Just then, a couple of her friends brought out their gift. It wasn't something fancy or expensive. It was a money tree, a little plant sitting in a small yellow coffee can. But hanging from its branches were dozens of small envelopes, and inside each one was a little bit of cash. Kem and Kurt both looked at it, their smiles growing even wider. They started to move through the small crowd, giving everyone a hug, thanking them for their kindness and their generosity. This was a huge night for them. It felt like all the plans they had been making, all the dreams they had been dreaming, were finally starting to fall into place. The very next day, they were going to pack up the last of Kurt's belongings into their car. They would then drive 230 miles south, away from the small Iowa town where he had been living, to the city of Bloomington, Illinois. Bloomington was just outside of Chicago, and it was where Kem already lived. And there, in Bloomington, they would start their new life together. They were going to be a family. A soon-to-be married couple raising Kem's two young children from her previous relationships. Their relationship had moved quickly. It had only been about 8 months since they had first met, and it had been on a blind date of all things. But for Kem, it was almost immediate. She knew from the start that Kurt was special, that he was the one. But getting to this point, to this happy night in a church basement, had not been easy. They were both struggling financially. Kurt was in the middle of his studies to become a Presbyterian minister, which is why he was living in Iowa to finish up at seminary school. Kem was a single mom in Bloomington, and she had recently been forced to quit her office job. A coworker there had been sexually harassing her, and she just couldn't take it anymore. To make ends meet, she had taken on work that paid her in cash, under the table. She was cutting hair and cleaning houses, but it wasn't enough. She still had to rely on public assistance to feed her kids and pay the rent. On top of the money problems, the long-distance relationship itself was just draining. All the driving back and forth, the hundreds of miles separating them, it was exhausting for both of them. And then there was the drama with the fathers of her two children. Her relationships with them were difficult, to say the least. The father of her 1-year-old son was a man named Dale Fosdick. He was always late with his child support payments, which put a huge strain on Kem's already tight budget. And he still acted like he had the right to just walk into her house whenever he pleased, without even knocking. It drove her crazy. Recently, Kurt had actually confronted Dale about it. He had told him, man to man, to stop doing that, to respect Kem's space. Dale did not take that well at all. And the father of her 7-year-old daughter, a man named Todd Wanger, wasn't much better. Todd and Kem fought constantly. They were always arguing over their custody arrangement and visitation schedules. To make things even more frustrating for Kem, her two exes, Dale and Todd, were actually friends with each other. It was a strange alliance that really annoyed her. But now, as she stood in that church basement and someone handed her a slice of cake, all of those problems, all of that stress, it all seemed to be getting a little bit smaller. It felt like it was all in the rearview mirror. Kurt was finally moving in with her. Her life was about to get organized, stable. Back at her home in Bloomington, she had a whole stack of Modern Bride magazines waiting for her. She was so excited to start planning their wedding. She and Kurt had even started talking about the possibility of Kurt adopting her young son. And she knew that with his education, Kurt could quickly find a good job in Bloomington as a pastoral counselor. They could start saving some money, especially since they would only have one household to pay for now instead of two. This money tree was a perfect start. Kem knew that the people in this congregation weren't wealthy. Not by a long shot. but the fact that they had all pooled their limited resources together to give her and Kurt such a wonderful and thoughtful gift, it really touched her. The only thing that could have made this moment better, truly perfect, would have been if her own mother, a woman everyone called Cricket, was there to share it with them. But unfortunately, Kem and Cricket were estranged. They didn't speak. Kem wished things were different. She wished she could be closer to her mom, but Cricket had a mean streak. She could be cruel. And for some reason that Kem could never quite understand, she absolutely hated Kurt. Kem finished her slice of cake and glanced at her watch. She realized it was getting late. She gently tapped Kurt on the shoulder while he was in the middle of a conversation with some friends. They still had so much to do tomorrow morning. They had to finish packing, and then they had that long drive ahead of them. So, Kem and Kurt made their final goodbyes, thanking everyone one last time. They walked out of the church together, holding hands, ready to start the next chapter of their lives. The next day was Saturday, May 22nd. Just as they had planned, Kem and Kurt spent the entire morning packing up boxes, loading the car, and saying their final farewells in Iowa. The second half of the day was spent on the road, driving south towards Illinois. Finally, at 10:30 that night, they pulled their car into the driveway of Kem's two-story house in Bloomington. This was it. This was the home they would now share together. For a moment, Kem just sat there in the passenger seat looking at the house. Kurt got out of the car and walked around to the back to open up the trunk. There was a lot of stuff to carry inside, but Kem was just so tired from the long day. She honestly didn't feel like moving just yet. So she watched as Kurt grabbed the first box and the little money tree they had been given. He walked up the front stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. A minute or so later, he came back out, his hands empty. At that point, Kem let out a little sigh. She knew she had to get up and help. She couldn't let him do it all by himself. Kurt was already halfway back down the front steps as Kem grabbed a box of her own from the trunk. She made her way up the same steps and walked into the foyer of her home. She set her box down on the floor and was just about to turn around and head back outside to do another trip with Kurt. But then, she paused. Her eyes caught something on the floor of the foyer. It was something she didn't recognize. Something that definitely had not been there when she had left for Iowa just a couple of days ago. Kurt was outside, his back to the house, when an incredible wave of pressure slammed into him. It was so intense, so powerful, that it almost threw him off his feet. At almost the exact same instant, a deafening boom like a massive explosion filled his ears. He stumbled forward, trying to keep his balance, and then he spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. He screamed out Kem's name. But his ears were ringing so badly now, a high-pitched whine that blocked out everything else. He couldn't tell if she had answered him or not. He looked up at the house and saw thick, black smoke pouring out from the front doorway. Without even thinking, his instincts took over. He just ran. He ran back up the stairs and straight into the house, into the smoke-filled foyer, desperate to find Kem. When he got inside, it was pure chaos. The air was thick with smoke and dust, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. There were shards of broken glass scattered everywhere. He also noticed dozens of little pieces of twisted metal all over the floor and embedded in the walls. Kurt screamed Kem's name again and again, his voice raw with panic. He looked frantically all around, trying to see through the haze and the rubble, but it was almost impossible. It was like the entire foyer had been obliterated. Now he was starting to gasp for air, choking on the acrid smoke. He started moving around the small space, ducking down below the thickest clouds of smoke, trying to see anything. And that's when he saw them. Lying on the floor, partially obscured by a fallen piece of drywall, were a pair of legs. Just a few minutes later, Detective Larry Shepard of the Bloomington Police Department pulled his cruiser up to the curb outside the two-story house. His partner was in the seat next to him, and another squad car was right behind them. Normally, Shepard wouldn't respond to a typical 911 call. He was a homicide detective. But he had been in the area when the call came over the radio. Dispatch had requested officers to check out a report of a possible shotgun blast on a quiet residential street. But the second Shepard stepped out of his car and laid eyes on that house, he knew this was no shotgun blast. Black smoke was billowing out of the front door. He couldn't see any flames, but he could clearly hear the high-pitched shriek of a fire alarm coming from inside. The street itself was in chaos. People, who Shepard assumed were neighbors, were out of their houses, shouting and running around in a panic. And there was debris everywhere. Broken glass, splintered pieces of wood, and strange chunks of metal had been blown out of the house and were scattered all over the front lawn and even out into the street. In the driveway of the home, Shepard could see a man. He had his hands on his head, and he looked absolutely frantic. He was pacing back and forth, yelling the name Kem over and over again as he stared at the destroyed house. It was at that moment that Shepard realized there must be someone still inside. He knew he couldn't wait for the fire department or more backup to arrive. He had to go in now. He and his partner shouted for everyone on the street to stay back, to clear the area. And then they both raced up the stairs and into the smoke. Once Shepard was inside the foyer, he could tell there was no active fire, just a lot of smoke hanging heavy in the air. He quickly took in the scene. He saw a 6-inch hole blasted into the wall right next to the front door. And there was another, similar hole right in the floor of the foyer. But his attention was immediately drawn to the body of a woman lying on the ground. One look was all it took. It was immediately and horribly clear that there was nothing anyone could do for her. Literally half of her head was just gone. In his entire career, Detective Shepard had never worked a murder case where the weapon was a bomb. But as he stood there in that blackened, destroyed foyer, looking down at the charred body of this woman, Shepard felt certain that a bomb was exactly what he was looking at right now. Around this time, the officers from the second squad car had made their way up the stairs and into the house. But Shepard immediately told them to get back. He ordered them to go back outside. This was not a safe scene. They needed the fire department here to clear the smoke and check for structural damage. And more importantly, they needed the bomb squad. For all they knew, there could be more explosives in the house. Not long after, Shepard and the other officers stood on the front lawn as members of the fire department and the state police bomb squad began to carefully comb through the scene. By this point, Detective Shepard had learned a little more about what had happened. The woman who had been killed was Kem Winghanger, and the man he had seen screaming her name in the driveway was her fiancé, Kurt Simon. Neighbors had told the first responding officers that the couple had arrived home at around 10:30 that night. A couple of the neighbors had actually been outside and had noticed them when they started unloading their car. These neighbors said they saw Kurt go into the house first. He was carrying a box that he had taken from the back of the car. Then, these same neighbors said they saw Kurt come back out of the house empty-handed. But he didn't grab another box. Instead, he went back to the trunk of the car and seemed to be putting something inside. It was at that exact moment that Kem had grabbed a box of her own from the car and had gone into the house by herself. And that's when the explosion happened. Shepard was troubled by these accounts. It seemed very suspicious to him that Kurt had been able to walk into the house just fine without getting hurt. And then, just seconds later, Kem goes in, and her arrival seems to be what triggered the explosion. It made him wonder. Maybe that box Kurt was carrying when he first went inside, maybe that was the bomb. Maybe he planted it, and then when he left, Kem went in, and it went off. And what was it that Kurt had put back into the trunk of his car after he came out? What was he trying to hide? But what was even more suspicious than any of that was what a preliminary sweep of Kem's home had turned up in the basement. Investigators had found wires, gunpowder, and fuses. Shepard didn't need to be a bomb expert to know that these were the components of a bomb. And it meant that whoever killed Kem had likely built the bomb right there in her own basement. And that fact, more than anything else, made Kurt Simon his #1 suspect. So, Shepard told a crime scene technician to process Kurt's car. He told him to pay extra special attention to the trunk. Then, the detective walked over to Kurt himself. Kurt was on the ground now, rocking back and forth. He was crying, and he was still just repeating Kem's name over and over again, like a mantra. Shepard gently asked Kurt if he could tell him what had happened. Kurt looked up at him, his eyes vacant and full of shock. He told the detective that he didn't know what happened. He said he had gone inside with a box, and he had just started back down the stairs when he felt the blast happen behind him. At this, Shepard's eyes narrowed. According to the neighbors, Kurt was actually at the trunk of his car, putting something inside at the time of the explosion. But now, Kurt was claiming he had only just stepped out of the house, that he was still on the stairs when the bomb went off. It was a small discrepancy, but it was significant. It could just be the result of confusion and trauma. Or Kurt could be lying to cover up his involvement. But for now, Shepard just told Kurt that he needed him to come down to the station for questioning. Several hours later, just before dawn on Sunday, May 23rd, Detective Shepard walked out of an interrogation room at the Bloomington, Illinois police station. He had just spent more than an hour hammering Kurt Simon with questions about his murdered fiancée. And Kurt had been a difficult interview. He had all sorts of ideas about other people who might have wanted to kill Kem. He told Shepard that both of the fathers of Kem's children, Dale Fosdick and Todd Winganger, were always fighting with her. And he said that Kem's estranged mother, Wilma Lewis, the woman they called Cricket, was, in his exact words, every kind of evil. But Kurt seemed to have no information to offer about what he himself had actually seen or heard in the moments before the explosion. He stuck to his story that he hadn't seen anything suspicious at all in the foyer, which Shepard just found very hard to believe. Kurt also had no explanation for why the bomb had exploded when Kem entered the house and not when he did. And he completely denied knowing anything about the bomb-making materials that had been found in Kem's basement. Kurt also insisted he hadn't put anything back in his trunk around the time of the explosion, but he couldn't explain why multiple neighbors had said they saw him do just that. Shepard felt that Kurt was either the most unobservant person he had ever met, or he was lying through his teeth. And to top it all off, Kurt had flat out refused to take a lie detector test. Still, Shepard had to let him go home. The detective just didn't have enough evidence to arrest him. Not yet, anyway. At this point, the bomb squad was still methodically searching the house for any other devices. That meant the crime scene technicians hadn't even been able to get inside yet to start looking for forensic evidence. They hadn't even been able to remove Kem's body. Shepard knew the day ahead was going to be long and incredibly busy. Other members of his team had spent the entire night canvassing the neighborhood and notifying Kem's family members, getting their initial statements. And now, Shepard was sure there was going to be a long line of people for him to interrogate. He had already been awake for a full 24 hours at this point, but he knew there would be no sleep for him anytime soon. So he walked over to the office coffee pot, poured himself a cup of stale black coffee, and stood there drinking it, thinking about how he was going to build a case and nail Kurt Simon for murder. Meanwhile, the story of the bombing was exploding across the news all over Illinois. By about 9 in the morning on Sunday, less than 12 hours after the explosion, there were reporters everywhere. They were milling around the front entrance of the police station, some of them even coming into the lobby, trying to talk to anyone who would give them a scrap of information. And Detective Shepard knew this story was only going to get bigger. The Illinois State Bomb Squad had just called in the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, to help them process the scene. All that meant was that there was going to be an enormous amount of public and political pressure on Shepard, who was the lead detective on the case. And this pressure was particularly stressful for him this morning because the case he thought he had against Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon, was already starting to fall apart. In all their interviews with Kem's friends, every single one of them had said that Kem and Kurt had a wonderful relationship. They were deeply in love and were so excited to start their new life together. The crime scene unit had thoroughly searched Kurt's car, the car where neighbors had claimed they saw him putting something in the trunk right after the blast. But the technicians had found nothing suspicious at all. Nothing in the trunk, nothing anywhere else in the vehicle. Shepard's partner had also been busy checking out Kurt's alibi. Kurt had told them he had spent the entire week before the explosion in Iowa, where he lived, and that he was just moving to Bloomington that weekend. They had checked it out, and it was true. He really had been in Iowa the whole time. This made Shepard's theory that Kurt had assembled the bomb in Kem's basement a lot less likely, since Kem had been home all week and Kurt was hundreds of miles away. Plus, Kem's babysitter had given the police 2 more pieces of information that really opened up the suspect pool. First, she said that the spare key to Kem's house had gone missing recently. And second, because that key was gone, Kem had gotten locked out of her own house at one point and had been forced to cut a hole in the screen of the back door to get inside. This meant that basically anyone could have gotten into Kem's house to build that bomb. They could have just come in through the damaged back door, or if they were the one who had stolen the spare key, they could have just walked right in the front. So, in the space of just a few hours, Shepard's suspect list had effectively gone from one person, Kurt Simon, to the entire city of Bloomington. Just before lunchtime, Shepard walked into the station's interrogation room where Kem's ex-husband, Todd Winghanger, was sitting and waiting for him. With Kurt looking less and less like a viable suspect, the detectives had turned their attention to Kem's exes. Both Todd, the father of her daughter, and Dale Fosdick, the father of her son, not only had clear motives, but they also knew Kem's schedule inside and out. In fact, each of them had been watching one of her children over the weekend while she was in Iowa. They knew exactly when she would be gone and when she would be coming back. Shepard's partner had actually already spoken to Dale a couple of hours after the explosion, while Shepard himself had been busy questioning Kurt. During that initial conversation, Dale had seemed genuinely shocked and upset by Kem's death. He had made what seemed like a real effort to answer the detective's questions, though his young son was with him and kept crying, constantly interrupting them. Dale did admit that there was tension between him and Kem. But he also had an alibi. He said he had been with his family that morning and then spent the afternoon and evening doing yard work in full view of all his neighbors. He had given Shepard's partner a list of names and phone numbers of people who could verify his story. A first round of calls to those witnesses seemed to suggest that Dale was telling the truth. But the detectives were conducting all of these interviews with very little solid information about the crime itself. They didn't really know how the bomb that killed Kem actually worked. They weren't sure if the killer had to be nearby to detonate it with some kind of remote, or if it had been on a timer. The scientists at the ATF were painstakingly trying to reconstruct the bomb from all the little fragments of shrapnel they had collected from the scene. But until they could do that, Shepard and his partner wouldn't know exactly when the killer would have needed to be at Kem's house. And none of the neighbors had reported seeing anything unusual around the time of the explosion that could help them narrow down that window. So now, as Detective Shepard sat down across the metal interrogation table from Kem's ex-husband, Todd Winghanger, he started with some general questions about his relationship with Kem. Todd seemed a little nervous. He kept wringing his hands as he spoke. He admitted that he and Kem did fight, mostly about child support costs. And he said he had been very frustrated with her during their divorce proceedings. He didn't feel like she was being fair. But he was adamant that none of that meant he wanted to hurt her. He insisted that their problems were just typical for most divorced couples. Shepard didn't put much stock in that. In his experience, a messy divorce or a bad breakup, especially when money was involved, was a very powerful motive for violence. So he asked Todd where he had been all day on Saturday, the night of the blast. At this question, Todd visibly relaxed. He leaned back in his chair and launched into a very detailed, moment-by-moment explanation of his entire day. He said he had been with his daughter and his new girlfriend, and he was certain that both of them would vouch for him. He also gave the detective a list of several other people who had seen them out and about during the day. By the time Shepard sent Todd home, he really wasn't sure what to think. He couldn't decide which of the exes, Todd or Dale, was a better suspect. Both of them clearly had issues with Kem and had a motive, but both of them also seemed to have solid alibi witnesses. On the other hand, Kem's fiancé, Kurt, might have had the opportunity to plant the bomb if it was placed just moments before the explosion, but he had no clear motive at all. So Todd and Dale had motive but no opportunity, and Kurt had opportunity but no motive. Shepard felt like he was just going in circles. He decided his next move should be to talk to Kem's family again. Maybe they could help him make sense of his very flawed suspect list. On Sunday evening, almost a full 24 hours after the explosion, Detective Shepard knocked on the door of the home where Kem's sister Joni lived. Another officer had already been there earlier to deliver the terrible news to her and their mother, Cricket, but Shepard wanted to hear from them himself. He had been told that Kem and her mother were estranged. But even though he went into the situation expecting it to be a little strange, Shepard was still completely caught off guard by the way Cricket was acting. It was beyond strange. It was way over the top. Joni answered the door and welcomed Shepard inside, offering him a seat on the couch. She was crying, her face puffy and red. Her reaction to the violent death of her sister seemed completely genuine and normal. But Cricket was not crying. She wasn't showing any signs of sadness or grief at all. Instead, she was just furious. And she wasn't furious about the murder itself, or about the fact that her daughter was dead, or even that the police hadn't made an arrest yet. No, she was furious about her daughter's life insurance policy. Apparently, Kem had not listed her as a beneficiary, which meant that Cricket was not going to get any money from her daughter's death. As Shepard sat there listening to this woman complain about money, he thought back to what Kurt had said during his interrogation. He had insisted that Cricket was a horrible person, that she was evil. At the time, Shepard hadn't really taken it that seriously. He figured Kurt was just trying to throw suspicion off of himself, and he knew that lots of people don't get along with their in-laws. But now, sitting here, he was starting to reconsider. He felt like he was witnessing someone who might just be as bad as Kurt had described. Then, when Shepard actually asked Cricket about her relationship with her daughter, Cricket just went off on a tirade. But she didn't really talk about her relationship with Kem. She talked about Kurt, and how Kurt had supposedly ruined Kem's life. She said Kurt was a terrible partner for Kem, and that he had destroyed the best relationship Kem ever had, which, according to Cricket, was with Dale Fosdick, the father of Kem's son. She also blamed Kurt for destroying her own relationship with Kem. She claimed that she and her daughter used to talk on the phone every single day, but once Kurt came into the picture, he had forbidden Kem to speak to her. To Shepard, Cricket seemed completely scattered. She was jumping from one angry subject to another, just mad at the entire world. But he started to wonder if what he was seeing wasn't just pure selfishness and a terrible personality. Maybe it was some kind of very complicated grief, or maybe even guilt. Or maybe it was grief and guilt all mixed together. But one thing was absolutely clear. Cricket hated Kurt just as much as Kurt seemed to hate her. And Shepard had no idea which one of them was telling the truth. It was around this point in the bizarre conversation that Kem's sister Joni cut in. She offered up a potential suspect of her own. She told the detective that Kem had recently left a job because a male colleague there, a man named Phil Hartman, had been sexually harassing her. Following the incident, Kem had actually received a financial settlement from the company. And apparently, Phil had made threats against her afterwards, including a promise that he would get her for what she had done. And so Joni said that it was Phil who the police really needed to be investigating for this murder. When Shepard finally left that house, his head was spinning. He had gone to talk to Cricket and Joni, hoping to get some clarity, hoping to sort out his three main suspects. But he had come away with even less clarity, and now he had 5 suspects. There was Kem's fiancé Kurt, her 2 exes Dale Fosdick, and Todd Winghanger, her former co-worker Phil Hartman, and frankly, Cricket herself. By now, it was late on Sunday night, and Shepard had been awake since Saturday morning. He was exhausted. He decided the best thing he could do for the case, and for himself, was to just go home and get some sleep. That way, he could come back with a clear head on Monday morning and maybe, just maybe, start to make some sense of it all. On the afternoon of Monday, May 24th, almost 2 full days after the bombing that killed Kem Winghanger, Detective Larry Shepard walked through the front door of Kem's house. He was feeling cautiously optimistic. On the night the bomb went off, the police had to evacuate the scene so the state bomb squad and the ATF could make sure there were no additional explosives. But finally, the night before, the scene had officially been cleared, which meant Shepard could now enter the house and look around for himself. Inside, the foyer was still in complete disarray, although by this point, Kem's body had been removed and taken for an autopsy. There were now dozens of little evidence flags and markers all over the floor and walls, pointing out where she had been positioned when she fell, and where various bomb fragments and other pieces of evidence had been collected. And now, because the federal agents had completed their preliminary assessment of the bomb, Shepard could actually start to picture how the bombing had happened. There was that 6-inch hole in the foyer floor. Shepard now knew that that was where the bomb had been placed. It had been sitting right there on the ground, probably concealed inside some kind of small box or package. From the autopsy report, which had shown very specific and distinct damage to Kem's right hand, Shepard knew what had likely happened. She had spotted the package on the floor, she had bent down and picked it up with her right hand, and that action, that movement, had triggered the explosion. And this was the single most important piece of information the feds had been able to determine: the bomb was motion activated. This was a huge breakthrough. It meant the bomber did not have to be at or even anywhere near Kem's house to trigger the explosion manually. Which meant they could have left that bomb there anytime over the weekend or even before. This also explained why investigators had found a random assortment of wires and other bomb-making materials in the basement. If the bomb had been built somewhere else and then transported to Kem's house in a car, the simple bumps and vibrations of the drive could have accidentally set it off. So, what most likely happened was that Kem's killer brought a partially finished bomb to the house, a bomb that was stable and wouldn't detonate while they were carrying it. And then they put the final volatile touches on it right there on site once it was in position in the foyer. This also meant that the bomber had to be pretty sophisticated. Building a motion-activated bomb like this took a certain amount of technical skill. It took intelligence and a real attention to detail, because if you make one wrong move, you set off the bomb and kill yourself. And so, in Shepard's mind, this likely took Kem's mother, Cricket, right off the suspect list. She just did not strike him as organized enough or coherent enough to pull off something this complex. She just seemed way too scatterbrained. Kem's exes, Dale Fosdick and Todd Winganger, both worked with their hands, with machines, for a living. So they were definitely still on the list. And her fiancé, Kurt, was highly educated, so he was still a possibility as well. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the coworker Kem had accused of sexual harassment. He had managed to reach Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew that just being physically far away from the bomb when it detonated was not a perfect alibi anymore, not with a motion-activated device. The killer could have placed it days before and then traveled. But still, Louisiana was a really long way away. And as far as Shepard could tell, Phil didn't seem to have any kind of technical background. So Phil was still on the list, but he was moving down it. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house. They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then they had clearly spent a good amount of time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came upstairs and were in the foyer, setting the thing up. This was someone who was incredibly confident that they were not going to get caught doing all of this inside the house. That was some serious boldness. And so, Shepard was starting to feel pretty certain that whoever had done this was either a family member or someone so close to Kem that they might as well have been family. Shepard left Kem's house, his mind already planning his next steps. He was thinking about how he could get search warrants for both Dale and Todd's workplaces to see if any of the machinery or tools they used there shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final front step and onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out his name from behind him. He turned to see another Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created a real sense of panic, not just in Bloomington, but all across the state of Illinois. People were now terrified that a bomb was going to show up on their own front porch. They were seeing packages they didn't recognize and calling the police, convinced that they could be explosives. It was like a wave of paranoia had swept over the state. In response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger and more visible presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked his officers to re-canvass Kem's neighborhood to go back and question all the neighbors again now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, they now knew that the bomb was motion activated. This meant the bomber did not need to be there right before it went off. They could have been in the house building the bomb days before. They could have planted the bomb well in advance of the bombing itself. So there was a much bigger window of time now. They were asking the neighbors different questions. Who was at Kem's house in the days leading up to the bombing? Did anyone see anyone acting suspicious near Kem's house that entire weekend? And so this officer who was running over to Shepard, that's what he had been doing. Re-canvassing the neighborhood. And when he finally reached Shepard, out of breath, he told him he'd found something. Shepard eagerly followed the officer over to one of Kem's neighbors' houses. And there on the front lawn, he saw a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing nervously next to her father. And based on what this little girl would say, along with all the evidence collected by the Bloomington Police Department and the ATF, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Kem Winghanger on the 22nd of May 1993. At around 10:30 that morning, the killer pulled up in their car and parked on the street outside of Kem's house. They reached over and picked up a bag that was sitting on their passenger seat. Inside the bag was a partially completed pipe bomb and some tools. With the bag in hand, they got out of the car, walked up to the front door, and pulled a key from their pocket. It was the same key they had stolen from under Kem's doormat a few months earlier. They used the key to unlock the front door and let themselves inside. The killer then walked down to the basement. They took all the various items out of the bag, placed them on a counter, and got to work. The killer was not worried at all about getting caught. They knew this neighborhood very well. Everybody in this neighborhood knew them, and no one would find it suspicious to see them there at Kem's house. Plus, they knew they would have a perfect alibi for the time period when the bomb would actually go off. Once the bomb was mostly assembled, the killer gathered up most of their things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but they figured it didn't really matter, since the explosion would destroy all the evidence anyway. Feeling very confident in their work, the killer walked back upstairs and placed the nearly completed bomb on the floor in the foyer. And then, as they completed the final delicate steps of arming the device, they could feel sweat beading on their forehead. They knew that if they did anything wrong, if their hands slipped, the bomb would go off right there in their face. But the killer got it all done. They stood up very slowly and carefully and walked back out through the front door. But before they could get in their car and drive away, they saw one of the neighborhood girls playing in the yard next door. The girl looked up at them and waved, and she said, "Hello." And the killer, feeling like they belonged there, feeling completely invisible, just waved back. Well, that little girl remembered that interaction. And she would tell Detective Shepard exactly who she saw leaving Kem's house that morning. It was none other than Kem's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son, Dale Fosdick. Dale was very upset that Kem had broken up with him and was now with Kurt. He had also heard from Cricket, who he was still very close with, that Kurt had been talking about adopting his son. And this enraged him. He could not stand the idea that his own boy might grow up calling another man dad. So he used the electronic skills and the tools he had acquired from his hobby of building model airplanes to construct a deadly pipe bomb. And so ultimately Dale was caught because of his own arrogance, his own sense of entitlement. He felt like he could just stroll into Kem's house anytime he wanted because he had done it so many times before, despite her telling him not to. He had become such a familiar face in the neighborhood that no one thought twice about seeing him there. And that's why that little girl remembered him. After months of painstaking forensic work that tied Dale even more closely to the components of the bomb, he was finally arrested. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 61 years in prison. But he would only serve 14 of those years. Because in 2010, while still behind bars, Dale died of a sudden illness. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. One afternoon in September of 1951, a 53-year-old father named Adolphus Eller pulled his car up to a boarding house in the city of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He got out, went to the trunk, and lifted out a large cardboard box filled with his daughter's belongings. He carried it up the steps, through the front door, and down a hallway to a room where his two 21-year-old daughters were already busy unpacking. Their names were Bobby and Betty. For the two young women, this was the most exciting day of their lives. They were moving out of their childhood home in the small, quiet town of Pearl Lear, about an hour's drive away. It was the first time they would be living on their own, away from their father Adolphus and their mother. They had both gotten jobs at the same cigarette factory, a major employer in the area, and they were going to be sharing this room together in the boarding house. It was a huge step for them, the real beginning of their adult lives. You could see the excitement just radiating off of them as they put their clothes into drawers and decided where to hang their pictures. But for their dad, Adolphus, the moment was bittersweet. On the one hand, he was incredibly proud. His girls were growing up, making their own way in the world. That's all any parent wants. But on the other hand, it was hard to let go. They were his little girls. He watched them for a moment, chattering and laughing, and felt a familiar mix of pride and sadness. Even though they were leaving the nest, he took comfort in one very important fact. They were still together. They were living together, working at the same place. He knew that even if he and their mom couldn't be there every day to look after them, they would always have each other. And that made him feel like they would be okay. You see, Bobby and Betty were not just sisters. They were identical twins. And their bond was deeper and more intense than most people could ever really understand. It went far beyond just being close siblings. They had a connection that seemed to defy normal explanation. They leaned into their identity as twins in every possible way. Physically, they were almost impossible to tell apart. Both stood at 5 feet 3 inches tall, with round faces and dark hair, which they always made sure to style in the exact same way. If one got a new haircut, the other would be in the salon the very next day getting the same one. But it went so much deeper than just their appearance. Their personalities and interests were almost perfectly mirrored, to a point that it sometimes seemed deliberate, almost forced. Both were social and outgoing. Both played the piano beautifully. They sang together in the school glee club. They both got good grades. It was as if they were two halves of a single person. But then there were the things they shared that just didn't seem possible. For example, they had a strange habit of getting sick at the exact same time, even with illnesses that weren't contagious. There was one instance that Adolphus and his wife never forgot. Bobby had developed a painful abscess on one of her teeth. She was genuinely sick from it, with a fever and a swollen jaw. It was a serious infection. Then, completely out of the blue, Betty developed an abscess in the very same tooth. The doctors couldn't explain it. This wasn't something you could fake or imagine. It was a real physical ailment that she had developed at the exact same moment as her twin sister. It was just one of many examples of their strange, unexplainable connection, and on the rare occasions when some difference was forced upon them, they would work very intentionally to erase that difference and become the same again. When Bobby's eyesight started to fail and she needed glasses, she was a little self-conscious about it. Betty, whose vision was perfectly fine, begged her parents to let her get glasses too. She didn't need them, but she couldn't stand the idea of being different from her sister in any way. So, she got a pair of glasses with plain lenses, just so they could look identical again. So now, this big move to Winston-Salem was just the next chapter in their shared life. The same job, the same factory, the same room, in the same boarding house. It was how they had always done things. A part of Adolphus and his wife had secretly hoped that as they got older, Bobby and Betty might start to become a little more independent of each other. It just seemed like the healthy, natural thing to do. But as he put down that last box and looked at his two daughters, both with the same wide, excited smile on their faces, he felt a wave of gratitude. Maybe this was for the best. This was a good intermediate step. They could take this leap into adulthood together, leaning on each other. It was a bridge. After a few more minutes of helping them get settled, Adolphus knew it was time to go. He gave them both a long hug and said, "Okay, I'm going to take off now. Best of luck. I love you both. Call whenever you need anything." And with that, he walked out, got in his car, and began the quiet, lonely drive back home. Fast forward 2 years. Adolphus was at home in Pearl Lear, setting the dining room table while his wife finished cooking dinner in the kitchen. It was a weekend, and Adolphus felt that familiar sense of happy anticipation. For the past 2 years, without fail, Bobby and Betty had driven home from Winston-Salem every single weekend to visit. It was the highlight of the week for Adolphus and his wife. They cherished this time with their daughters, hearing all about their jobs and their new lives. Just as Adolphus placed the last dinner plate on the table, he heard a knock at the front door. He smiled to himself. Right on time. "They're here," he called to his wife. He walked to the door, ready to greet both of his girls, but when he opened it, he was surprised. It was just Bobby. Betty was nowhere in sight. He looked past her, toward the driveway, expecting to see Betty getting out of the car. He asked, "Where's Betty? Is she in the car?" Bobby just shook her head and said no. That's when Adolphus noticed that Bobby had luggage with her, a couple of suitcases, and she looked terribly sad. Her usual bright expression was gone, replaced by a look of deep unhappiness, almost depression. "Bobby, what's going on?" he asked, his heart starting to sink. She looked down at the ground and said quietly, "I hated my job at the factory. I hated it. So I quit. I'm coming home." Adolphus was stunned. This was a huge shift. The twins did everything together. They always had. Even if one of them wasn't particularly interested in something, she would usually go along with it just to maintain their sameness. The idea that one would quit this big new life they had built together while the other stayed was a massive departure from their entire history. Adolphus tried to process it. "And Betty?" he asked. "She doesn't hate her job. She's going to stay. She's going to keep working at the factory and living there." The news was jarring. But then he shifted focus back to the immediate situation. "Okay, well, of course you can stay here. Of course you can come home. But where's Betty? Is she coming to visit this weekend? Even if she's still working, she's still coming for the weekend, right?" Again, Bobby shook her head. "No. She's staying in Winston-Salem this weekend." This was another shock. They had never missed a weekend visit. It just felt like the world had tilted on its axis. What was going on with his girls? But Adolphus pushed his confusion aside. His daughter was hurting. He put his arm around her and said, "Look, just come on in. Have some dinner. Get settled. We'll talk about this. We'll figure out what your next steps are. Of course, you can stay here. Everything will be fine." Bobby picked up her bags and stepped inside. But as her mother came out to greet her, Bobby just said she wasn't hungry and didn't want to eat. Then she walked straight up to her old bedroom, brought her things inside, and shut the door. She didn't come out again that night. And for the next 2 years, that's mostly where Bobby stayed. In her bedroom, the door was almost always closed. She rarely left the room, and when she did, it was just for brief trips to the bathroom or to get a glass of water, and then she would retreat right back into her sanctuary. She had almost completely shut down. She never explained to her parents what she hated so much about the factory job. She never talked about anything, really. The social, extroverted girl they knew had vanished. In her place was a recluse. She didn't try to reconnect with any of her old friends from high school. She didn't look for a new job or show any interest in her future. It was as if her life had just stopped. She was just existing, day after day, inside those four walls. But there was one thing that could bring the old Bobby back, if only for a little while. And that was when Betty came home to visit on the weekends. The moment Betty walked through the front door, it was like a switch was flipped. Bobby would emerge from her room, her face would light up, and she would instantly become her old self again. The two of them would fall right back into their old rhythm, laughing and talking as if no time had passed. There was no resentment, no awkwardness about the fact that their lives had taken such different paths. For those 2 days, everything was normal again. And then, Sunday evening would come, Betty would leave to go back to her job and her life in Winston-Salem, and Bobby would walk back into her bedroom and shut the door. The light would go out again. For Adolphus and his wife, it was agonizing to watch. They had always hoped their daughters would find some independence. But now it seemed that while Betty was managing to do okay on her own, Bobby was completely falling apart without her sister. She was utterly dependent on Betty for her happiness, for her very sense of self. It was so clear. Adolphus didn't know how this could ever be resolved. It just seemed to be getting worse and worse for Bobby as time went on. Then, around the 2-year mark of Bobby being home, something else unexpected happened. Betty came home one Friday for her usual weekend visit. But this time, she had luggage with her, just like Bobby had 2 years prior. She walked in and announced, "I quit the factory too. I'm moving back home." In a strange way, Adolphus and his wife felt a sense of relief. Their first thought was for Bobby. This had to be a good thing for her. With Betty home for good, surely Bobby would return to her normal self. They had seen how happy she was every time Betty visited. Maybe now that happiness would be permanent. But there was also a sense of unease. It just didn't make sense for Betty to quit her job. She seemed to like it. She seemed to be thriving on her own. Adolphus couldn't prove it, but he had a strong suspicion about what was really happening. He believed Betty was making a sacrifice. She was giving up her independent life to come home and be with her sister, to fall back into step with her just like they always did. It seemed like the only explanation. Still, the silver lining was that maybe, just maybe, their daughters would be happy and healthy again. But that is not what happened. Once Betty was back home, the two sisters did fall back in step with each other, just as their parents had predicted. But it wasn't a return to their old happy selves. Their connection, their dependence on each other, became more extreme than it had ever been before. And it had already been extreme. This was something else entirely. They both moved into Bobby's old bedroom. They went inside, shut the door, and basically never came out. They didn't become the extroverted girls they used to be. Instead, they became introverted together. They showed no interest in finding jobs, socializing with friends, or doing anything at all. They just stayed in that room, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They slept in the same bed. On the rare occasions they did leave the bedroom, they were physically inseparable. They would walk side by side, their shoulders touching. They moved in perfect sync, almost like robots. If one went to the kitchen, the other went too. If one went to the bathroom, the other went with her. They could not be apart, not even for a second. It was a level of attachment that their parents had never seen before, and it was deeply unsettling. Adolphus and his wife were terrified. They didn't even have a name for what they were witnessing. It was codependency on a level that seemed pathological. They kept hoping that it was just a phase, that the girls would eventually level out and get their lives back on track. But then it got even worse. On top of everything else, they stopped eating. At first, it was just occasional. Adolphus would go up to the bedroom at dinner time and knock on the door. It would open just a crack, and both Bobby's and Betty's faces would appear in the gap, looking out at him. Adolphus would say, "Hey, dinner's on the table. Are you coming down to eat?" And the girls, without even looking at each other, would respond in perfect, eerie unison, "We're not hungry." Then they would shut the door. It happened night after night. Weeks went by, and the girls were refusing almost all food. They began to lose a shocking amount of weight. Their faces became gaunt, their bodies frail. But no matter how much their parents begged and pleaded with them, they just would not eat. After a few weeks of this, Adolphus and his wife knew they couldn't handle this on their own. Logic wasn't working. Pleading wasn't working. There was something deeply wrong, and it seemed increasingly obvious that it was a serious mental health issue. They made the difficult decision to seek professional help. They brought Bobby and Betty to see a psychiatrist. After several sessions with the twins, the psychiatrist gave them a diagnosis. He said that both Bobby and Betty had schizophrenia, a very serious and chronic brain disorder that can dramatically affect a person's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. The psychiatrist explained that many of their strange behaviors, particularly their extreme codependency and their refusal to eat, could be symptoms of this illness. He prescribed them both powerful antipsychotic medication and assured Adolphus and his wife that if the twins took their medicine as directed, they would get better. The parents felt a glimmer of hope. Finally, they had an answer and a path forward. They made sure Bobby and Betty took their medication every single day, exactly as prescribed. But the twins didn't get any better. In fact, they seemed to get worse. They spent even more time locked in their bedroom. They became even more frail. And they started showing signs of extreme paranoia. They were mistrustful of everyone, including their own parents. It was as if the only person in the world each of them could trust was the other. Anyone else was a threat. Pretty quickly, Adolphus realized the medication wasn't working. He didn't necessarily doubt the diagnosis. The symptoms of schizophrenia seemed to fit what he was seeing. But the treatment was failing. He decided they needed more intensive help, a higher level of care. So, in early 1961, when Bobby and Betty were now 30 years old, Adolphus made the heartbreaking decision to have them both involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. At first, it seemed to be exactly what they needed. At the hospital, they were monitored around the clock. The staff made sure they ate their meals, so they started to gain weight back. They were given proper medication under professional supervision. And, crucially, the hospital staff allowed them to stay in the same room together. They were never separated, and having each other for support seemed to be a key part of their recovery. After several weeks, they were deemed healthy enough to be discharged. They seemed to be back to their old selves. But almost as soon as they got back to their family home, they regressed. They went right back to their bedroom, shut the door, and the whole destructive cycle started all over again. The seclusion, the not eating, the paranoia. And so, they were committed to the hospital again. And again, they got better while they were there. And again, they were discharged. And again, they got worse as soon as they were home. This pattern repeated over and over again for more than a year. They were in and out of the hospital, trapped in a loop with no real progress being made. Eventually, Adolphus, his wife, and the team of doctors and nurses who had been treating the twins came to a difficult and controversial conclusion. They started to wonder if the root of the problem wasn't schizophrenia at all. Maybe the schizophrenia was a symptom of a deeper issue. Maybe the problem was their intense, all-consuming dependency on each other. What had once seemed like a beautiful, timeless bond between sisters was now being viewed as a deeply unhealthy, pathological codependency. They were so enmeshed with each other that neither of them could function as an individual. They were stuck, and unless some drastic action was taken, they would continue this downward spiral indefinitely. And so, a decision was made. A radical, last-ditch effort to save them. Without telling the girls, the doctors and their parents agreed that they had to be forcibly separated. And so, on the 11th of April, 1962, Bobby and Betty were once again committed to the hospital. But this time was different. For the very first time in their lives, they were separated. They were put in rooms at opposite ends of the hospital in completely separate wards. When they realized what was happening, they completely lost their minds. They begged, they screamed, they cried, demanding to be put back together. But the staff held firm, telling them it was for their own good. A few hours later, in the dead of night, it was around 1 a.m. on April 12th. Adolphus was at home, asleep in his bed. The phone rang, jolting him awake. He was confused. Who would be calling at this hour? He picked it up and heard the voice of one of the hospital doctors on the other end. The doctor sounded frantic, his voice shaking. He was trying to explain to Adolphus what had happened after the girls were separated, but the words were tumbling out in a jumbled, panicked mess. Adolphus couldn't make sense of it. He kept asking, "What are you talking about? What happened?" Finally, the doctor took a deep breath, paused, and then very clearly stated the unbelievable, disastrous thing that had unfolded. It was something no one could have ever planned for, something the doctor himself couldn't comprehend. As Adolphus listened, he just sat there on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, completely frozen, unable to process the words he was hearing. Over the next few days, the doctors at that psychiatric hospital tried to find a rational, scientific explanation for what had happened on the night Bobby and Betty were separated. They couldn't. They were completely baffled. So, they called in the North Carolina State Board of Investigators for help. The investigators came, they looked at all the evidence, and they couldn't figure it out either. So, they called in the FBI. The federal agents reviewed the case, and they too were stumped. Nobody had any idea how this could have happened. As the story inevitably leaked to the press, it became a national sensation. Newspapers all over the country ran articles about the unbelievable mystery of the Eller twins. And as people read the story, many began to wonder if the explanation wasn't rooted in science at all. Maybe what had happened was something beyond our human understanding. Something that science couldn't measure or explain, but that didn't make it any less real. It turns out that at 12:55 a.m. on the night the twins were separated, a nurse in the ward where Bobby had been placed was doing her regular rounds. When she got to Bobby's room, she looked in and saw Bobby lying in her bed, on her side. The nurse thought she was asleep, but when she went to check on her, she discovered that Bobby was dead. Just 5 minutes later, at exactly 1 a.m., a doctor went to check on Betty in her room on the complete other side of the hospital. The doctor found Betty dead in her bed, lying in the exact same position as her sister. The most baffling part was that there was no obvious cause of death for either of them. There were no signs of illness, no signs of self-harm, no signs of foul play or violence of any kind. It was as if, at almost the exact same moment, both of their bodies had simply decided to stop working. Even after multiple, thorough autopsies were performed, no medical reason for their deaths could be found. They hadn't been poisoned. They didn't have heart attacks or strokes. Medically speaking, they were healthy one moment and dead the next. The only conclusion anyone could draw was that the twins had died simultaneously from no apparent cause. Their official cause of death was listed as ill-defined and unknown. The only theory that ever emerged came from one of the doctors who had treated them. He believed that Bobby and Betty were so deeply distressed by being forcibly separated that they had found a way to reunite. He suggested that they had, in his words, willed themselves to die. He proposed that their spiritual, physical, and emotional need to be together was so powerful that when it was taken away, their bodies simply shut down in the hope that their spirits could reconnect in death. It's a wild, unbelievable theory. But there is one final strange detail about the way they died that seems to lend it a chilling layer of credibility. It suggests that whatever happened that night was something truly beyond our comprehension. When the staff found Bobby and Betty's bodies just 5 minutes apart on opposite ends of the hospital, they weren't just lying in the same position. They were positioned on their beds in a slightly awkward, unnatural way. You know how a bed is a rectangle, and you normally lie on it vertically, parallel to the long sides. Well, the girls were found lying at a slight angle on their respective beds. At first, it was just noted as a strange anomaly. But then, someone had a thought. They imagined what it would look like if you could remove all the walls of the hospital. If you could see from Bobby's room all the way down the corridors to Betty's room, and when they mapped it out, they realized the strange angle wasn't random at all. The way the girls had positioned themselves on their beds meant that through all those walls and all that distance, they were looking directly at each other at the moment they died. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. When you think of Russia, your thoughts most likely go to the major cities that are located on the western edge of the country, which is the region of the country that is geographically located in Europe. You may visualize the onion domes that are so famous in Moscow or the streets of St. Petersburg, which are so historically significant. That is correct, by the way. The majority of the population are located there, and the majority of the historical events that we read about took place there. On the other hand, the portion of Russia known as European Russia accounts for only roughly 23% of the overall area of the country. A vast, untamed, and frequently cruel swath of territory that extends all the way to the Pacific Ocean makes up the remaining 77% of the land of the United States. A region known as Siberia is located here. An understatement would be to suggest that Siberia is a landmass. The vastness of this globe, which is comprised of lush woods, towering mountain ranges, and icy tundra, is approximately 50 times larger than the entirety of the United Kingdom. Extremism is the word that best defines what is going on here. One of the most difficult obstacles to overcome is the weather. Over the course of a whole year, the average temperature across the entirety of Siberia is consistently rather close to freezing. Because it can reach temperatures that are unfathomable throughout the winter, it is considered to be one of the coldest spots on the globe where people live. Moreover, the weather is not the only thing that is attempting to take your life. Just as daunting is the wildlife that can be found in Siberia. The grizzly bears that are found in North America are of the same species as the enormous brown bears that you have. Gray wolves can be found in packs, and some of them can grow to reach almost 200 pounds in weight, making them dwarf any other wolves you could encounter in other places. And then there is the Siberian tiger, which is a predator that is both extremely intelligent and extremely powerful. One of the few creatures on Earth that has been documented to intentionally hunt humans, sometimes even for vengeance, these tigers are among the few that have been known to do so. There is a well-known tale that dates back to 1997 about a hunter who accidentally shot and injured a Siberian tiger. This tiger did not pass away. As an alternative, it followed the hunter all the way back to his cabin, waited for him to emerge from the building, and then proceeded to murder and consume him. As you might have guessed, the number of people who choose to reside in Siberia is relatively low. Given the enormous extent of the area, the population is extremely small. On the other hand, for a particular category of individuals, the very same traits that scare away the majority of people are the precise things that attract them. Siberia is one of the few truly wild areas on Earth, and it is a final frontier that needs to be experienced by those who are interested in taking on new challenges and traveling. Additionally, a young man from the United States by the name of Colin Madsen was one of these daring individuals. Growing up in Missouri, Colin was a member of a family that was both prosperous and caring. Since he was a little boy, he had a deep fascination with the natural world. He enjoyed going on hikes, camping, and simply being outside in the greenery. When he was younger, he began reading about Siberia at some time in his life. After looking at photographs of its wild and unspoiled beauty, he became utterly enthralled by the place. What he was interested in was not merely a passing curiosity. In the depths of it, he dove. He started learning about the history of Russia and Siberia, and he even taught himself how to speak Russian well. It wasn't enough for him to simply travel to Siberia. He wanted to live there and completely submerge himself in the culture. Furthermore, in the year 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he was able to turn his desire into success. Irkutsk, which is located in the middle of the world, became his new home after he packed his belongings, said his goodbyes to his family in Missouri, and went there. Irkutsk is one of the few large population concentrations in the southeast region of Siberia, and it is situated directly on the shore of Lake Baikal. The natural wonder that is Lake Baikal is, in and of itself, it is the freshwater lake that is both the oldest and the deepest in the world. It is so deep and clear that in certain areas you can see more than 100 feet below the surface. The idea that Colin had for his new life in Siberia was straightforward but nonetheless grandiose. In order to further his education, he would enroll in a university, and in his leisure time he would spend it exploring the wilderness that he had fantasized about for such a long time. Moreover, over a period of time, everything proceeded precisely in accordance with that plan. As soon as he was accepted into the local branch of Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, he was able to immediately form a group of friends who shared his enthusiasm for the great outdoors. It was a group of individuals who, just like him, were anxious to explore the immense wilderness that was Siberia. The life that Colin had always desired was the life that he had from the time he came in 2013 until the year 2016. Not only did he excel in his academic pursuits, but he also enthusiastically spent endless weekends and holidays going on hikes and camping in the mountains and forests that encircled Lake Baikal. In addition, he was not only a tourist who went hiking for fun. After gaining such a deep understanding of the area and becoming proficient in negotiating its difficult terrain, he decided to begin working for a local group that was dedicated to charitable causes. Their objective was to establish and label new hiking paths so that others might enjoy them in a secure environment. As a result, Colin was essentially venturing into undiscovered area, so paving the way for new routes through the Siberian wilderness. In a setting where there was very little room for error, he was a knowledgeable individual who was regarded for his abilities and his composed approach to surviving in the environment. Because of this, when his family received the news in 2016 about what had occurred to him, it was something that they simply were unable to comprehend. In the month of March in the year 2016, Colin and 3 of his closest hiking companions came to the conclusion that it was time for new adventures. As well as being an American, one of the pals was also Russian, and the other 2 were American. In the same way as Colin was, all of them were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. Following the examination of maps, they settled on a destination, which turned out to be the peak of a mountain that was referred to as Love Peak. They were a few hours' drive away from their home base in Irkutsk, which was located in a little settlement named Arshan. Love Peak was located there. Now, when compared to other hikes in Siberia, this one was not particularly challenging at all. There were some steep sections on the trail that led up to the peak, but it was fairly well defined and had been walked quite a bit. Every single one of the 4 men, including Colin, had hiked it on multiple occasions in the past. It was a trip that was both familiar and reasonably risk-free. Being seasoned hikers in Siberia, however, meant that they were aware of one thing above all others: you should never show disrespect to the natural environment. Without proper preparation, even the most straightforward hike could turn out to be fatal. Anywhere could be a potential danger. As a result, they were very serious about their preparations. In order to rent a tiny rustic cabin at the foot of the mountain, the intention was to drive to Arshan and make the trip there. Using this cottage as their base camp would be their plan. Before beginning their ascent early the following morning, it would provide them with a location to get themselves organized, check their equipment, and get a full night's sleep the night before. Therefore, they made a reservation in advance for one of the cute tiny cabins that were tucked away in the woods and were located close to the trailhead. A few days later, on the morning of March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends began the journey to the village of Arshan by embarking on a westbound journey from Irkutsk. They packed their car with all of their equipment and supplies and began their journey. Upon their arrival, they made a brief detour at a nearby store to purchase some water and food for the last minute, and then they proceeded to make their way to the cabin that they had leased. Exactly as they had anticipated, it was a straightforward location. It was essentially a single room with a few beds, which was just enough to provide refuge from the chilly environmental conditions of Siberia. Inside, there was no plumbing available. In the event that you required the use of the restroom, there was a modest outhouse located a short distance away from the cabin. The four companions made themselves comfortable, claimed their mattresses, and immediately began arranging their belongings in preparation for the hike that would take place the next day. They continued to converse, eat, and simply take pleasure in each other's presence as they sat around. The atmosphere was upbeat and full of excitement for the ascent that was still to come. They came to a conclusion regarding their strategy, which stated that they would get up at 5 in the morning to complete their last preparations, with the intention of getting on the route and climbing to the summit of Love Peak no later than 7 o'clock. They were well aware that in order to make that happen, they needed to get some rest. Therefore, at 2 in the morning, they ensured that the lights in the cabin were turned out, and then all four of their companions went to bed. It was precisely 5 o'clock in the morning when the alarms went off, which was 3 hours later. At that moment, one of the companions reached over and turned on the light in the cabin. And, at that particular moment, it was manifestly obvious that something was extremely, extremely wrong. He was not in his bed at the time. It was not until later that there was a feeling of panic. After looking over at his vacant bed, the other three buddies noticed that all of his personal possessions were still at the location where they had been left. All of his belongings, including his bag, his hiking gear, his wallet, and his phone, were arranged in an orderly fashion exactly where he had left them the previous evening. It was the first and most reasonable assumption that he must have gotten up a little bit earlier than usual and sneaked out of the cabin in a stealthy manner. It is possible that he needed to use the outhouse, or it is also possible that he simply desired to go outdoors and take a breath of fresh air. It was their assumption that he had simply been quiet in order to avoid waking them up and that he would return at any moment. As a result, the three buddies began to get ready for the day, disregarding Colin's absence from these preparations. They anticipated that he would return at any moment and go back through the door. Despite the fact that he had gone for a little walk before morning in order to stretch his legs, he was aware of the plan. He had a strict adherence to the plans. Without a doubt, he would return by 7 o'clock, which was the time that they had agreed upon for their departure. However, as the minutes ticked by steadily, a feeling of dread started to make its way into the room. There was a passing of 5:30. Then it is 6 o'clock. Next, it is 6:30. Colin has not been seen or heard from since. It was not a phone call. He had not sent a text message. Just now, he had disappeared. Concerns began to arise among the friends. Colin's behavior was utterly out of character in this regard. It was he who was accountable, the one who was an adept navigator. Without informing anyone of his intended destination, he would not just disappear into the night in the middle of the Siberian wilderness without a known destination. In no way did it make any sense at all. 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time that they had agreed to leave, Colin was still absent. With the passage of time, the original feeling of worry had developed into a full-blown concern. The region immediately surrounding the cabin was the subject of a speedy search that his friends conducted. They inquired about his name. The outhouse was examined once more by them. As the frost covered the ground, they searched for any footprints that might have been left behind. And still, they discovered nothing. It appeared as though he had simply exited the cabin and vanished from existence. It was as if he had passed away. They were aware that they needed to seek assistance at that point. Simply waiting around was no longer an option for them. A brief message was written by them before they left, and it was affixed to the front door of the cabin for safekeeping. The sender of the message was Colin. The note read something along the lines of, "If you come back and see this, we've gone to get help. We're looking for you. Please stay here or let someone know you're safe." After posting the note, the three friends left the cabin and went straight to the nearest police station in Arshan to let them know that their friend was missing. It was taken quite seriously by the local police department. Unusual was the disappearance of a young and experienced American outdoorsman who had been out in the wilderness. Almost immediately, they started a comprehensive search operation. An enormous search area was conducted, which encompassed the thick forest that surrounded the settlement of Arshan and extended all the way up the slopes of Love Peak itself. There were scores of local volunteers, including some individuals from the group that Colin had worked with in the past, who participated in the massive effort that was undertaken by law enforcement authorities, professional rescue teams, and other volunteers. Every single one of them was really worried since they were aware of how skilled he was. When Colin's family returned to the United States, they were confronted with the phone call that every parent dreads receiving. It was reported to them that their son had gone missing in Siberia. In response, they expressed complete and utter astonishment. A Colin? Is it lost? It appeared to be impossible. It turned out to be the young man who had spent years researching the environment in question. The individual in question was not a careless traveler who strayed off the path. It was almost as if he was an expert in the area. They made frantic efforts to obtain information, but in light of the fact that they were located thousands of miles away, they felt absolutely useless. They had no choice except to wait, hope, and pray for a solution. The search went on, day after day, without stopping. Due to the extreme weather conditions, which included freezing winds and snow on occasion, the search conditions were considered to be challenging and risky. In the Siberian wilderness, the expanse of the forest seemed intimidating. Out there, it is possible for a person to vanish without ever being located. The hope of discovering Colin alive began to dwindle as the days continued to pass, with one day turning into 2, then 3, and finally ending up being a full week. In the end, a breakthrough occurred on Monday, April 4th, which was 8 full days after Colin had vanished from the cabin over the previous week. Around 1 mile distant from the cabin, a group of people were searching through a part of forest while looking for the missing person. It was a heavily populated and challenging location to get through. A little clearing appeared in front of them as they made their way through the dense underbrush and the trees that were blocking their path. And in the midst of that expansive clearing, they caught sight of something. It was, as the search party got closer, that they realized their worst fears were correct. Yes, it was Colin. And it was too late for him. In the middle of the clearing, he was discovered lying on his back in a flat position. An odd, almost posed stance was arranged on his body, and it was quite peculiar. His right arm was also extended, but it was bent slightly and brought closer to his body. His left arm was stretched out straight to his side, and his right arm was also extended. At the same time, he had both of his palms gripped into a firm, tight fist. After conducting a more thorough investigation, the first responders discovered a number of unsettling details. On both of his wrists and on both of his hands, there were wounds and abrasions that were clearly evident. The pattern of these injuries appeared to be what a medical examiner would refer to as restraint marks. It appeared as though someone or something had been holding him down with a great deal of force. On the front of his neck, there were also scrapes and abrasions that were present. His attire, which included a thermal shirt with long sleeves, heavy-duty hiking pants, and his robust hiking boots, was ripped and torn in multiple places, which indicated that he had been involved in a violent conflict. In addition to that, there was a peculiar and insignificant information that would turn out to be of great importance. No socks were on Colin's feet at the time. Inside his hiking boots, which were tightly knotted, he was wearing his bare feet. Despite the fact that this may appear to be a trivial matter, for everyone who knew Colin, it was a significant warning sign. A substantial amount of scar tissue was left behind on Colin's ankles as a result of the procedures that he had previously undergone on both of them. It was something that he had mentioned to his friends and family on numerous occasions that if he did not wear thick socks, the scar tissue would scrape against the inside of his boots, causing him to experience excruciating discomfort. Never in his life did he go trekking without his socks on. He adhered to this norm in his daily life. Nevertheless, the state of the body was the aspect that the medical staff who initially inspected it found to be the most puzzling. It is reasonable to anticipate that a body would exhibit substantial signs of decomposition after being exposed to the environment and the animals for a period of 8 days in the remote regions of Siberia. Colin's body, on the other hand, exhibited hardly none. According to the remarks of one official, all of his wounds, including the cuts and abrasions on his wrists and neck, appeared to be fresh. It appeared as if the struggle and his death had occurred no more than a few moments ago. To put it succinctly, the scene did not give the impression that the person had become disoriented and had given in to the elements. It seemed as though the individual had lately been involved in a serious physical altercation, one that he had been unsuccessful in winning. The scene appeared to be that of a homicide. The Russian authorities proceeded with a stunning speed to shut the case, despite the fact that there was a lot of evidence that was both bizarre and persuasive. Their first hypothesis, which swiftly evolved into their official conclusion, was that all three of Colin's buddies had to have been involved in the crime. However, the friends were brought in for further interrogation, and they all denied having any involvement with Colin's death. Additionally, they all volunteered to take lie detector tests, which they all passed after they were given the opportunity to do so. It appeared as though the Russian authorities had lost interest in any other possible instances of foul play now that their major suspects had been implicated. Rapidly, they came to an agreement on a conclusive and formal answer. As a result, they came to the conclusion that Colin must have been under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both. During this changed state, they asserted that he must have wandered out of the cabin in a state of disorientation, become disoriented in the woods, and ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. It was determined that the case was closed. He died of a frozen state. The story has come to an end. The answer that was provided to Colin's parents was not only unsatisfactory, but it was also an insult to their son's memory. They were familiar with Colin. He was not a person who acted recklessly. It was not true that he was a drug user. Furthermore, he was an absolute master when it came to getting around in that particular region of Siberia. The concept that he would simply wander off and become so hopelessly lost that he would die of exposure a mile away from his cabin appeared to be totally absurd. The official account did not make sense, and there were an excessive number of questions that remained unresolved. All of the evidence, including the clenched fists, the restraining marks, the missing socks, the wounds that appeared to be new, and the absence of decomposition, did not fit into the straightforward story of a guy who died from freezing to death. Because they were unwilling to accept the official decision, Colin's parents made the decision to take matters into their own hands. They had the knowledge that they required an impartial and objective opinion. Therefore, they decided to use a private forensic laboratory that is situated in the United States and has a stellar reputation. They arranged for all of the material from the Russian autopsy, including the reports, the photographs, and the findings of the toxicological test, to be delivered to this laboratory for a comprehensive examination. Whether the conclusion reached by the Russians was correct, or whether something far more ominous had occurred to their son, they were interested in being informed. The American laboratory started its investigation, and it didn't take them long to discover significant flaws in the official position taken by the Russian government. As a matter of fact, their discoveries entirely disassembled it, each component by component. The toxicological report was the first thing that they looked at. The Russian authorities had proposed the idea that Colin was either under the influence of alcohol or drugs. After doing an analysis of the toxicology data, the laboratory in the United States came to the conclusion that this is unquestionably not true. Colin was not under the effect of alcohol at any point in it. When he was sober, an extremely minute and insignificant quantity of THC, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana, was discovered in his urine. On the other hand, the level was so low that it suggested that he had probably consumed it quite a few days, if not a week, or perhaps more, before to his disappearance. It is quite unlikely that it would have had any kind of psychotropic impact on him on the night that he goes missing. This discovery was in direct and total opposition to the fundamental tenet of the hypothesis that the Russian police had been using. Second, the laboratory investigated the root of the death. The official diagnosis was hypothermia as the cause of death. But the forensic pathologists from the United States arrived at a different conclusion. According to the evidence that was found in the photographs taken during the autopsy, particularly the abrasions that were found on his neck, as well as other internal markers, they came to the conclusion that Colin did not die as a result of being exposed to the cold. All of the signals, on the other hand, pointed to a considerably more violent conclusion. Based on their findings, they concluded that suffocation was the most likely cause of death. He was the victim of a homicide. Until the moment he passed away, his capacity to breathe was severely restricted because someone had either suffocated him or crushed his airway. This brings us to the third and possibly most disturbing point. The laboratory examined the condition of Colin's body when it was discovered. It was corroborated by them that the initial responders had noticed the nearly complete absence of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries, and the fact that his body had not been touched by any animals that were foraging for food, which is quite unusual for a body that has been left in the woods for more than a week. In light of this information, they came to a conclusion that was shocking. It indicated that Colin had not passed away on the night that he could not be found. It indicated that he had been alive for the majority of the 8 days that hundreds of people had been searching for him, if not all of them simultaneously. The evidence strongly suggested that he had died within a very short time, most likely just a few hours before his body was discovered in that area on April 4th. This was the conclusion that was reached by using the evidence. These fresh discoveries from the American laboratory revealed a horrifying and devastating new picture of what must have occurred to Colin Madsen because of his circumstances. The situation was not one in which a hiker became disoriented. This was a case of kidnapping and murdering the victim. Consequently, let us make an effort to reconstruct the events by using this new evidence that is more exact. On March 28, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, Colin awoke. This occurred somewhere in the pre-dawn hours of the day. He climbed out of his bed in a stealthy manner and exited the cabin. Utilizing the outhouse, which was located a short distance away, would be the most reasonable explanation for this behavior. His attire was not appropriate for a hike. Neither of his belongings were taken by him. Even his socks were not put on by him. The intention was for this to be a little excursion, nothing more than a minute or two, and then straight back to bed. As soon as he went out into the chilly and gloomy morning of Siberia, however, he discovered that he was not alone. They were waiting in the shadows, and it was either someone or some individuals. The fact that a violent struggle took place is something that we are aware of, but we do not know whether they ambushed him or whether they enticed him away from the cabin. These are the telltale indicators of a guy who is battling for his life. The shredded clothing, the abrasions on his hands and wrists, and the clenched fists. On the other hand, he was ultimately defeated. He had been kidnapped. Probably the most terrifying aspect of this enigma is what transpired after that with him. He was kidnapped from the environment surrounding the cabin and held captive for close to 8 days in a location unknown. This is where he was abducted. Why was he taken away from us? We are unable to provide responses to these queries. He was being detained against his will for a period of 8 days, during which time his friends, his family, and a large search party were making frantic efforts to locate him. Imagine the suffering that he must have been subjected to during that period of time. After that, his assailant or assailants murdered him on or around April 4th, which was the day that his body was discovered. Suffocation was the result. Following his passing, his body was relocated and positioned in that area in the forest, which was approximately 1 mile away from the cabin. Where is that? Would you say that the location was one that was chosen on purpose? Was the intention to make it simple to locate in order to convey some kind of message? Or was it simply a spot that was convenient for him to be left? When he is placed on his back with his arms extended, it gives the impression that he was placed there on purpose, rather than being a body that was simply abandoned. Therefore, the most important question is, who would do this and why would they do it? One theory, which is supported by a significant number of individuals, suggests that the Russian government or some local authorities are responsible. In Siberia, it was discovered that Colin, who had a strong commitment to protecting the environment, had taken part in at least one protest that was staged inside a peaceful setting. An unauthorized development in the area of Lake Baikal was the target of the protest. Following the conclusion of this demonstration, it is believed that Colin was issued a formal written warning by the Russian police, instructing him to refrain from attending any such rallies of this nature. What if this is the reason for it? Is it true that he was considered a problematic American activist? What happened to him? Was he singled out, kidnapped for questioning, and then murdered? This is a somewhat unsettling idea. It is possible that this is the reason why the official investigation was so quick to close off any line of inquiry that did not entail a straightforward accident. It's possible that a failed probe was actually a deliberate attempt to cover up the truth. On the other hand, this idea is not without its flaws. With so many other people participating in the demonstration, why would the government single out Colin? And why would they pick to kidnap him on a night when he was with three of his closest friends, individuals who would immediately notice his absence and raise the alarm if they were to find him missing? An operation that is being carried out in secret appears to be carried out in a very poor manner. There are other hypotheses that suggest it could have been a crime of opportunity, a robbery that went awry, or a personal quarrel with a nearby resident that we are unaware of. However, none of these hypotheses adequately explain the peculiar and protracted character of the crime, which consisted of the 8-day period of captivity prior to the murder. It was not surprising to see how the Russian authorities would respond to the discoveries that were discovered by the American laboratory. They were entirely disregarded by anyone. They remained steadfast in their judgment that the death was the result of hypothermia brought on by an accident. However, the investigation in Russia has not yet been concluded. This is not a riddle that needs to be solved for them. Those who were close to Colin described the event as a complete nightmare. Not only did they suffer the loss of their good buddy in the most heinous manner, but they also had to go through the agony of being the major suspects in his killing, even if it was only for a little period of time or for a short period of time. The shocking events that transpired over that week are likely to remain with them for the rest of their lives. The anguish that Colin's parents are experiencing is never-ending. Despite their best efforts, they have been unable to achieve justice for their son. The government of Russia does not give any cooperation, does not provide any fresh information, and there is no possibility that the case will ever be reopened. They are left with the horrific knowledge that their kid was murdered, but it is possible that they will never know who was responsible for the crime or why it was committed. When it comes to this investigation, they are forced to consider the same questions over and over again. Who was hiding in the shadows outside of that cabin in the early morning hours when it was completely dark? To what location did they take Colin? And during those 8 days when they were unable to find him, before they killed him and left him deep within that huge and merciless Siberian wilderness, what did they do to him? You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the evening of the 12th of February 1949, a man in his 30s named Leonardo Paez was pacing back and forth inside a radio station in Quito, the capital city of Ecuador. It was a Saturday night, and Leonardo and the handful of people with him were working frantically to prepare for a broadcast. This wasn't just any broadcast. It was an urgent one. Leonardo was the director of Radio Quito, which was one of the most respected and influential news sources in the entire country. The station was owned by a very popular newspaper called El Comercio. For most people living in Ecuador at the time, if you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you were either listening to Radio Quito or reading El Comercio. Or maybe both. Running a station with that kind of reputation was a huge point of pride for Leonardo. He had grown up in Quito, and he took his job very, very seriously. And that was why tonight was so important to him. He was about to deliver a broadcast that he believed could change lives all across the city. Just thinking about the weight of this moment was making his palms sweat and his stomach churn. In the room with Leonardo was a small team of producers and sound technicians, along with one of the station's best news anchors. Most of their last-minute work involved organizing big stacks of paper. These papers had all the instructions for what to say and what to do during this very important broadcast. The anchor was looking over the script one last time. He was the one who had actually written it, and he was the one who would be reading it live on the air in just a few minutes. Leonardo glanced anxiously at the clock on the wall. It was already a little bit after 9 o'clock at night, and they were running out of time. Even though Leonardo felt this intense urge to get things started, he knew he couldn't rush it. He had to give his anchor the time he needed to be 100% ready before they went live. They only had one chance to get this right. So, instead of telling the anchor to hurry up, Leonardo just bit his lip and kept pacing. He tried to distract himself by listening to the program that was currently playing over the station's airwaves. It was a live musical performance by a very famous singing duo named Benitez and Valencia. In the 1940s in Ecuador, these two singers were incredibly popular. They were like the biggest stars of their time. So when people in Quito heard that Benitez and Valencia were performing on the radio, pretty much everyone would stop what they were doing and tune in. Back then, nobody in Quito had a television. The radio was the ultimate source of entertainment and news. It was the center of everything. But radios were also expensive, a luxury item that not every family could afford. So what would happen is, people who did own a radio would often bring it outside onto the street or open their windows. That way, their neighbors and people walking by could also listen to the programs and the music. Leonardo knew exactly what this meant. At this very moment, all across the city, most of Quito's 250,000 residents were gathered around a radio listening to that performance. He needed to get his special broadcast on the air while he still had a captive audience. He turned and saw the anchor finally lean back in his chair. It was a small signal, but it meant he was ready. Leonardo knew it was time. He turned and gave a sharp nod to his technicians. They were all sitting at a long table covered with knobs, wires, and broadcasting equipment. One of them saw Leonardo's signal, leaned forward, and adjusted several knobs on the control panel. Then, he pressed a single button. The instant he did, the beautiful voices of the singing duo were cut off mid-song. A large red sign on the wall above the control table lit up, and in bright letters it said "On Air." They were about to interrupt the most popular show on the radio to deliver their message, and they knew it would catch everyone in Quito completely off guard. The anchor leaned into his microphone. In a serious, urgent voice, he announced that they were interrupting the musical program for a developing story. He said there was an alarming event happening that everyone in Quito needed to hear about. Then he paused for effect before explaining the reason for the interruption. Ecuador was being invaded. About half a mile away from the radio station, a 17-year-old named Jose Antonio was standing outside a restaurant with a group of his friends. Jose, his friends, and all the people eating at the tables outside had been gathered around the restaurant owner's radio. They were all enjoying the music of Benitez and Valencia when it suddenly stopped. Then the announcer came on, his voice filled with gravity, saying that their country was under attack. As Jose and the others stood there completely stunned, the announcer's voice got more emphatic. He said, "Listen, the city of Latacunga has been destroyed." At that, Jose's mouth dropped open. A jolt of pure fear shot through his chest. Latacunga was a city only about 60 miles south of Quito. Instinctively, Jose and everyone around him leaned in closer to the radio. They needed to hear more. They needed to know what was happening and why. But just as they leaned in, the broadcast stopped just as abruptly as it had started. The music program came back on the air, as if nothing had happened. The street fell silent. Jose and the crowd of people just stood there, waiting. Nobody knew how to react. A few people started looking up at the sky, as if they expected to see warplanes flying overhead. Jose found himself doing the same thing, scanning the dark night sky, wondering what would happen next. But there were no planes. There were no signs of war, nothing to indicate that whatever had destroyed Latacunga was now approaching Quito. All Jose could hear was the faint echo of other radios around the city, all of them now playing the musical program again. As the seconds ticked by, the crowd slowly started talking again. Some people began to make nervous jokes, suggesting the whole thing was a prank. Others just shrugged it off and went back to their conversations and their meals, acting as if the interruption never even happened. But Jose noticed something. Some of the people sitting at the tables were still just staring at the radio. They were shifting in their seats, looking restless and uncomfortable. That broadcast had clearly struck a nerve with them. Jose couldn't shake the feeling either. He kept fidgeting and exchanging worried looks with his friends. He wasn't so sure this was a joke. And the reason he was so worried was because a sudden invasion of their country wasn't just a fantasy. It had actually happened before. Just 7 years earlier, in 1941, when Jose was only a kid, the much larger neighboring country of Peru had invaded Ecuador. It started as an argument over land along their shared border. But instead of settling it with words, the Peruvian army had stormed into the disputed territory and conquered it easily. The fighting had only lasted for about a month before Ecuador had to accept defeat and give up the land. Even though that fighting had never reached Quito, it had been a terrifying time for everyone living in the city. It made them realize just how vulnerable they were, how they couldn't really defend themselves against a powerful foreign invader. And then, as Jose and the others were still grappling with what to think, the music on the radio cut out again. The broadcaster's voice returned, and he said he had an update. He said the enemy had landed aircraft on the outskirts of Quito in a northern area called Cotocolao. That was only 8 miles from the city center. Suddenly, a horrible realization dawned on Jose and everyone listening. If the enemy had destroyed Latacunga in the south, and now they had landed in Cotocolao in the north, then the city of Quito was completely surrounded. Before Jose could even fully process that terrifying thought, another man's voice came on the radio. Unlike the first announcer, who was urgent but relatively calm, this new voice was pure panic. He identified himself as the chief of Quito's newspaper. Then he screamed into the microphone, "The airbase has been taken over by the enemy and destroyed. They're exterminating everything and everyone." He kept yelling, his voice cracking with terror. He said the enemy was using poisonous gas and fire. They were killing people, destroying homes and buildings. And then he issued a simple, chilling warning. "They're coming." Jose let out a yelp that he couldn't control. He was so overcome with sudden terror that the sound just escaped him. But he barely even heard it because all around him, everyone else was reacting the same way. The street erupted in screams, prayers, and absolute chaos. Some people started pointing up at the sky, yelling that they could see the enemy planes. More and more people poured out of buildings and homes, flooding the streets, crowding around the radios to try and get more information. They were all terrified. No one knew what was going on. Jose wanted to try and explain to the newcomers what they had heard so far, but it was impossible. Everyone was shouting over each other. It was complete madness. And on the radio, it was just as chaotic. Different voices were cutting in and out. It sounded like the news station itself was in a panic, unable to get a clear message out. But through all the noise, one word kept coming through over and over again. Hide. Hide from the enemy. Hide. Jose and some of the people around him were thinking about doing just that, about running, when a new voice took over the broadcast. This man's voice was louder, more authoritative. It immediately projected a sense of calm that cut through some of the panic, both on the radio and in the crowd. This person sounded like a government official. He introduced himself as the mayor of Quito. He confirmed that yes, cities around Quito were under attack. But, he said, he had clear directions that he wanted everyone in the city to follow. Hearing this, Jose felt a small flicker of hope. Finally, someone was in charge. Someone would tell them what to do. But that feeling didn't last long. The mayor's instructions didn't make Jose feel any better. He told the people of Quito that all women and children had to flee. They had to go hide, find somewhere safe, get away. But the men, he said, had to stay and fight. Jose felt a rush of adrenaline. He was 17. Was he old enough to be considered a man? Would he be expected to fight, or would they tell him to run away with the women and children? He didn't know. But then, a strange sense of calm came over him. He thought, we're at war and I am going to fight. He signaled to his friends a silent message that said, let's go. Let's get ready. The group of boys came together and started to move away from the restaurant. At that exact moment, a car came speeding down the street, narrowly missing them. Jose watched as it screeched around a corner, and then he heard a loud bang and the sickening crunch of metal hitting stone. Immediately, some men ran towards the sound of the crash to see if they could help. But other people were running in the opposite direction. For Jose and his friends, it was impossible to know what to do. Should they go help with the car crash? Or should they try to find the front lines wherever they were? At the same time, women were running past, clutching their children. Jose saw a pregnant woman stumble by, her face contorted in pain as she held her stomach. Screams were echoing from all around him, mixed with the frantic sound of boots pounding on the cobblestone streets as people ran in every direction. Jose was still trying to figure out which way to go when another speaker's voice came on the radio. He announced himself as the Minister of Government, which was basically the person in charge of security for the entire country. And what he said next extinguished any last bit of hope. The Minister of Government said to forget what the mayor had told them about fighting. He said that Ecuador's weapons were not powerful enough. There was nothing that anyone in Ecuador could do. The minister was essentially saying that they were going to lose. Just then, another new voice came on the radio. It was a man talking very fast, and he said he was reporting live from the ground in Quito. He screamed into his microphone for everyone to run. And then, his feed just cut out. The original announcer came back on, his voice shaking, and said that the reporter who had just been speaking had been killed. It was now 9:21 p.m. Only 21 minutes had passed since the broadcast had first started. And in that short time, the entire city had spiraled into total madness. Remember, Jose was still gathered with his friends. They had started to leave the restaurant, but so much had happened so fast that they were just kind of frozen there on the sidewalk, not sure what to do next. As they stood there, Jose noticed a change. All the people who had been hesitating, who had just been sitting or standing near the radios, it was like they all got up at once and just started running. Running to the churches to pray. Running to their homes to get their families. The entire city was in a full-blown panic. Jose saw families running out of their houses, dragging suitcases and whatever belongings they could carry, getting ready to evacuate. But where could they even go? The broadcast had said they were surrounded. Just then, Jose heard the sound of glass shattering. He looked over and saw a few people at the restaurant's bar, grabbing bottles of liquor from the shelves. They were pouring themselves drinks and then just tossing the empty bottles on the floor. Jose looked around for his friends and realized they had gone. He was standing there, all alone. He knew he couldn't just stand there anymore. He had to do something. He had to act. But just then, the radio crackled back to life one last time. A voice was calling out a final update. But the chaos all around him was so loud with all the screaming and running that Jose couldn't understand what this final update was. He just didn't hear it. But he could see that other people had heard it. And he could see their reaction. They stopped. Everyone just stopped running. They put down their suitcases. They stopped screaming. And everyone just kind of stood there for a moment. And then they started going for their guns and their knives and their torches. A huge crowd, now armed, came together. And then they all began to move as one, all heading in the same direction towards the city center. Inside the Radio Quito station in the city center, Leonardo watched as the anchor delivered that final update. The one that Jose hadn't heard, but that had made everyone else stop panicking and get angry. A minute later, Leonardo heard the sound of glass shattering somewhere on the floor below him. Then he heard a loud, crackling sound. He smelled smoke. The air inside the studio in front of him was starting to get hazy. And then, from the street outside the building, he heard someone yelling, "Fire!" Behind Leonardo, the anchor grabbed the microphone and pleaded on the air for anyone who was listening to please come and help. The radio station was in trouble, but there was no one left to help them. They were on their own. When Leonardo and his team realized this, they knew they had to get out. They ran together out of the studio and down the stairs towards the exit. But before they could even get to the bottom of the staircase, the smoke from the fire became so thick that they couldn't breathe. Leonardo realized the entire first floor must be engulfed in flames. The only way out was not down, but up. So Leonardo led the group back the way they came. They ran back up through the second-floor offices and the studio where they had just recorded the broadcast. They headed up the stairs to the very top floor of the building. By the time Leonardo got to the top floor, he could hear horrible, painful screams coming from somewhere below him. He hoped his coworkers had managed to follow him, but there was so much smoke in the building now that he couldn't see anything. He didn't know who was with him and who had been left behind. The roar of the fire was getting louder every second. It was so hot that sweat was pouring down Leonardo's face, stinging his eyes. He instinctively ran away from the thickest smoke, towards the windows. Because they were on the top floor, 3 stories up, he had a clear view of the ground below. He saw huge crowds of people on the street. Most of them were holding torches, and they seemed to be running around in a frenzy. He saw big military tanks rolling in behind them, and a hazy mist, some kind of gas, was flowing through the crowd. Just then, Leonardo felt the floor under his feet begin to shake. He frantically tried to think of a way out, a way to escape, and that's when he saw it. The roof next door. The radio station was right next to a school which was not yet on fire. The school building wasn't connected to the radio station, but it was close. Close enough that Leonardo thought he might be able to open the window he was standing near, get a running start, and literally jump out of the window and land on the school's roof. Of course, if he didn't make the jump, he would fall 3 stories to the street below and die. But the alternative was to stay in the building and be burned alive. So Leonardo opened the window. He backed up, took a deep breath, got a running start, and he jumped. He flew through the air, his arms flailing, willing himself to reach the school roof. After a split second in the air, he came crashing down, slamming hard onto the roof of the school building. He had made it. It was painful, but he was alive. He had escaped. But Leonardo didn't have time to waste. He didn't have time to see if anyone else would try to make the jump. He felt like he was on his own. So he got up. Despite the pain from the impact, he was mostly okay. He walked across the roof of the school until he got to the next building. This building was right up against the school, so he climbed onto its roof and walked across that one until he reached the next. He was moving from roof to roof, high above the chaotic streets of Quito. Down below, he could still see the madness. The tanks, the people with torches. He still didn't really understand what was going on. Eventually, as he made his way across the rooftops, he came to a roof where a family was sitting. They were just watching the city, where the sky was glowing red from the light of the fire he had just escaped. When they saw Leonardo, they told him they had been down on the streets, in that crowd. But when it got too dangerous, they had come up here to get away. They asked Leonardo if he had done the same thing. Leonardo said no. He told them who he was, how he had gotten there, and why. And then he asked them for help. For a moment, the family just stared at him in shock. Then they started talking to each other in low voices. From what Leonardo could hear, and from the looks on their faces, they seemed angry. But finally, the father looked at Leonardo and said yes, they would help him. But there was one condition. He told Leonardo that under no circumstances could he go back down to the street. The father said Leonardo would have to hide in their house. Because, the father explained, everyone in the city, including all those people down there, wanted Leonardo's head. It would turn out that Leonardo's broadcast had been wildly successful. It had done exactly what he had hoped it would do. It had grabbed the attention of everyone in Quito. The whole city had stopped to listen. But there was one very important fact that Leonardo had decided not to mention until the very end of the broadcast. By the time he did, it was already too late. This fact was the final update. The one Jose had been unable to hear. The one that had caused everyone on the street who did hear it to stop running and screaming and instead grab their guns and knives and torches and head for the center of town. The fact that was held off until the very end was that the entire broadcast was a fake. The invasion wasn't real. It was an act. A prank. A joke. The broadcast was a theatrical performance. It was an adaptation of a famous fiction novel called The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is about an alien invasion. So what Leonardo did was orchestrate this broadcast to sound and feel like a real breaking news report about an alien invasion happening in their own country. The exact same thing had been done in the United States a few years earlier, in 1938. But in the American version, the listeners had been warned at the beginning of the broadcast that it was a work of fiction. And even with that warning, it still caused mass panic. So, during Leonardo's broadcast in Quito, when he finally revealed the truth at the very end, the listeners were not relieved. They weren't amused. They were furious. So furious, in fact, that they marched to the radio station in the city center where Leonardo and his crew were, and they set it on fire. Between the fire at the radio station and all the people who took their own lives because they genuinely believed that aliens were about to kill them, the death toll from that one night, from that one prank, was somewhere between 6 and 20 people. And many, many more people were injured in the chaos. As for 17-year-old Jose Antonio, he would survive. And later in life, he would give a detailed interview about his experience during the so-called alien invasion. As for Leonardo, he never faced any criminal charges. No jail time, nothing. But the incident completely destroyed his reputation in Ecuador. People didn't trust him anymore, and it was impossible for him to find work. Eventually, he had to leave the country and move to Venezuela. And as for Radio Quito, the once powerful and important news station, they wouldn't make another broadcast for 2 whole years after that night. On the evening of Sunday, the 26th of January, 1851, a 2-3-year-old man named Bailey Staples hurried up the walkway of a home in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was so cold that Bailey's could see his breath in the frosty air. But, despite the weather, he couldn't stop smiling. He was about to do something he loved, something that made him a lot of money. And this was already the 3rd time he was doing it today. Bailey's was a psychic medium, and he was about to perform a seance. At this point in American history, in 1851, a phenomenon called the spiritualist movement was sweeping the nation. Huge numbers of people had come to believe that the living and the dead could actually communicate with each other through gifted individuals like Bailey's. And at this time, there was a very specific way that mediums conducted their seances. They would sit at a round table with all the guests who were participating. Then they would begin to summon spirits. The participants could tell when a spirit had made contact with the medium because the table they were all sitting at would start to shake or move. Sometimes a table would thump so violently that one of its legs would actually break off. And a broken table at a seance was considered a sign of a huge success. Seances were a craze all over the country. Many people genuinely believed that mediums like Bailey's could talk to ghosts. But there were also lots of people who thought it was all complete nonsense. But even the non-believers would still hire people like Bailey's to perform seances at parties and gatherings. It was a form of entertainment, kind of like hiring a magician or a band for the evening. In Fall River, Massachusetts, there was a big appetite for these seances from both believers and skeptics. This was partly because many of the old homes in Fall River had histories of being haunted, so the groundwork was already laid for people to be interested. Now, to be clear, Bailey's whole seance act was a complete fake. In fact, many of the people who hired him knew in advance that it was all just a performance. They knew that Bailey's was more of an actor than a real psychic medium. But Bailey's was very, very good at faking it. He had become the go-to medium in Fall River. And to keep his business thriving, he knew he had to put his full energy into every single performance. So, on this day, as Bailey's was getting ready to start his third seance of the day, he was tired. These performances were physically exhausting. But he knew he had to find a second wind and push through. He had to make this one just as good, if not better, than the others. As the homeowner of this third seance opened the door and let him inside, Bailey's was sure it was going to be a great show. A few moments later, the homeowner, a man named John Gardner, led Bailey's into the living room where several other guests were already waiting. Bailey's immediately snapped into character. He made his cape swoosh as he walked in, and he waved his hand dramatically around the room to command everyone's attention. When all eyes were on him, he said in a booming voice, "I have broken 2 tables today, and now I've come to break yours." The guests all cheered and clapped. Bailey's could tell they were going to be an enthusiastic audience, which always made the seances much more fun. They all went into the parlor and took their seats around a big circular table in the middle of the room. Bailey's dimmed the lights and walked around the table, giving his instructions. He told them all to hover their hands over the table, palms down with their fingers spread. He explained that each of them had to be touching the hands of the person sitting next to them. This, he said, would create a circuit that was more inviting to the spirits. Once all the guests were in position, Dolentes took his own seat and did the same thing with his hands, completing the circle. Everyone was ready. He nodded, and in a commanding voice, he announced that he was now going to speak to the spirits. And if the spirits in the room felt like answering, they would move the table. The room became deadly quiet. Everyone waited to see what Bailey's would do next. But Bailey's just let the tension build. He knew that the longer he waited, the more the anticipation would grow. This was his favorite part of the performance. He could feel his own heart starting to race with excitement. Finally, he broke the silence. He called out to the spirits in the room, demanding that if there was a ghost present, it should make itself known. As he said this, everyone immediately began to look around the room excitedly. This created the perfect, quick distraction that Bailey's needed to perform his first trick. Mediums at the time used a few different tools to help them fake communication with ghosts. One of those tools was a set of special hooks that they attached to their wrists, hidden under their long sleeves. When they put their hands palm down over the table, just like they told everyone else to do, those hooks would actually go underneath the table and grip the edge. This allowed the medium to lift and rattle the table without appearing to touch it at all. It actually took a lot of strength to do this. Imagine trying to move a huge, heavy table using just your wrists, while keeping your arms looking relaxed and hovering over the top. But Bailey's had gotten very good at it. So, as his guests were all looking around for ghosts, Bailey's masterfully hooked his hooks under the table. He began to move his wrists, and the table let out a loud thump. As soon as it happened, a woman on the other side of the table screamed. The other guests started laughing and getting excited. But Bailey's was just getting started. He called out to the spirit again, much more forcefully this time, and as he did, he used his strength to make the entire table rise up off the floor. All the guests gasped. One man asked how Bailey's was doing it. He knew it was fake, but he couldn't figure out the trick. Bailey's hands were still just hovering over the table. Bailey's just ignored the man and smiled. He then said to the spirit, "If you are willing to communicate with us, rap on this table 1 time. Then Bailey's used one of his hooks to make a single, sharp knocking sound from under the table. As he did, the woman who had screamed before jumped in her seat. She was so scared. Seeing her reaction gave Bailey's a surge of adrenaline. He was really doing a good job. So Bailey's leaned into it. He rattled the table a bit more for dramatic effect. He was really exerting himself now, trying his best not to show any sign of physical effort while making the table dance. He was sweating. He was yelling out to the spirits, demanding that they come forward and talk. But then, as Bailey's was in the middle of this big performance, something strange happened. He suddenly felt the room turn icy cold. He felt a weird tingling sensation flow through his entire body. He blinked, and his vision became hazy. This had never happened to him before during a seance. It was clearly having an effect on him, because he stopped his performance. He was no longer trying to communicate with the dead. He was just standing there, feeling very uneasy. It felt like the seance was actually working, like there really might be spirits in the room. Bailey's could feel everyone staring at him. He knew he couldn't ruin his business. He had to maintain the act. He couldn't just get spooked and stop the seance. But at the same time, he couldn't seem to break out of this weird feeling. The room felt so cold. Something was wrong. He tried to move, but it was like he was frozen in place. Across the table, the homeowner, John Gardner, was just sitting there, staring at Bailey's, trying to figure out what was happening. From his perspective, he watched as Bailey's went from standing there awkwardly, unable to move, to then suddenly sitting down hard in his chair and lurching back into a strange position. Then, Bailey's eyes started darting all over the room. His breathing became ragged and heavy. John couldn't help but feel that it looked like Bailey's was actually possessed. For real. Then Bailey's began to speak. His voice cracked as he mumbled something that John and the others couldn't understand. John was spooked. This performance was incredibly convincing. He almost wanted to applaud. Bailey's acting was so good. But he didn't want to break the spell. Like Bailey's, John and most of his guests didn't believe seances were real at all. But Bailey's performance was turning out to be way better than any of them had expected. But just then, Bailey's shot up out of his chair. The whole table thumped and shook again. Then Bailey's let out a long, ghostly-sounding moan. One of John's guests asked if the ghost was speaking through Bailey's. Instead of answering, Bailey's eyes rolled all the way back in his head so that only the whites were visible. John and the others were transfixed. This was incredible. It was actually kind of scary. But then Bailey's let out another moan and fell backwards, hard, onto the floor. For a second, there was just confused silence in the room. If this wasn't an act, then that was a violent fall. This looked too legitimate. How was Bailey's able to do this? It seemed real. And it was in that moment of realizing that something was truly wrong here, some of the guests began to scream. They started running out of the room. A few minutes later, a local physician named Dr. Hopper ran into the parlor of John Gardner's home. He had been summoned by one of the guests who had panicked and run to get him. But that guest had been rambling about a ghost and a possession, so Dr. Hopper really wasn't sure what kind of emergency he was responding to. But now he could see a group of people dressed for a party, all gathered around what looked like a seance table. They were pointing to the floor where a young man was lying in a crumpled heap. Doctor. Hopper went to the young man and reached out to feel his neck. There was no pulse. The doctor turned and looked at the group. He said, "He's dead." Before the group could even react, the doctor said, "Now hold on. Someone needs to slowly and clearly explain what happened here." John Gardner stepped forward. In a very shaky voice, he explained that the young man was a medium named Bailey Staples. He had been conducting a seance, and he had demanded that a ghost talk to the group. A moment later, he was thrashing around, apparently possessed by this ghost, and then he fell to the ground, dead. John said they had all thought the seance was a fake. When they hired Bailey's, they thought it was just going to be a performance. But now, they didn't know what to think. It had all looked very real. Doctor. Hopper shook his head, not sure what to make of this story. He certainly did not believe in ghosts. But after a quick examination of Bailey's, he couldn't see any obvious cause for the young man's death. So, Doctor, Hopper got to his feet and told the dinner guests that whatever killed Bailey Staples, it wasn't a ghost. But he didn't know what it was yet. He promised them he would get to the bottom of it. By the next morning, news of Bailey's death had spread all over Fall River and beyond. And this made the immediate autopsy that Dr. Hopper wanted to perform basically impossible. The problem was, some people were now claiming that a ghost had possessed Bailey's, but it hadn't actually killed him. They believed the ghost had put Bailey's into a deep trance where he only appeared to be dead. They argued that if Dr. Hopper performed an autopsy on him, the autopsy itself would be what killed Bailey's. So, pretty quickly, you had all these people showing up at Dr. Hopper's clinic and at the local police station. They were demanding that the authorities give them Bailey's body to prevent the doctor from murdering him with an autopsy. It was a whole scene. And at the same time, this story was spreading like wildfire all over the country. At a time when people in America were already fascinated with seances, this story seemed to legitimize the idea that ghosts were real and that they could be dangerous. It just dumped gasoline on the fire of the spiritualist movement. Seances became even more popular, but now people were attending them because they felt they were real, not just for entertainment. On January 28th, 2 days after Bailey's was pronounced dead, Dr. Hopper stood in the basement of the local morgue holding a scalpel. He had finally gotten the approval to go ahead with the autopsy, but he knew that a lot of people were not happy about it. He was looking down at Bailey's body, and he realized that to his own surprise, he was a little bit nervous. The thought kept creeping into his mind, what if this man is still alive, and I'm about to kill him? Logically, the doctor did not believe Bailey's was in a trance. But it was unsettling how physically healthy Bailey's body looked. He was young and strong, with no history of illness. And there wasn't a single mark on his body to explain why he was dead. The only blemishes on his skin were some slight bruises around his wrists, which Dr. Hopper knew were from the special hooks he had been wearing to lift the table. Doctor. Hopper shook off the nerves. He moved his scalpel towards the skin of Bailey's chest and made his first incision, opening up the chest cavity. And that was when Dr. Hopper saw it. It would turn out that on the day Bailey Staples died, he was at his absolute performative peak. He was lifting John Gardner's heavy table up off the ground, making the seance guests scream and laugh. But what Bailey's didn't know, and what Dr. Hopper found when he performed the autopsy, was that Bailey's had a pre-existing heart condition. His passionate, energetic performance, coupled with the immense physical exertion it took to lift that heavy parlor table using only his wrists, and the fact that Bailey's had already given 2 other similar performances that same day, had caused his weak heart to swell. It developed an aneurysm, which then ruptured, causing fatal internal bleeding. Bailey Staples had basically put on the best seance performance of his life. It was so good, in fact, that it killed him. And in doing so, he accidentally convinced a whole house full of dinner guests and many people all across the country that ghosts were real. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.